The question is whether God is necessary for morality. It's not up to me to argue that God doesn't exist or that God isn't necessary. God's existence isn't necessary. It's not the question at all, and so of course I'm not going to present an argument against that or for the non-necessity of God. We can do that, but that doesn't seem to be relevant to the specific topic here.
I didn't hear an argument against God's necessity. In fact, the only thing I did hear that was close to there being an argument against God's necessity, he said, here's my argument, and he said, the argument I have for God not being necessary is that there are no good arguments that God is necessary. Well, that's not an argument. That's saying the reason I don't believe it is because I don't think you're right. Well, of course you don't. That's the point of the debate here, is to find out who's right, not saying simply I don't believe you're right. Aristotle used a wonderful illustration. He said, if I move a rock with a staff, the staff moved the rock, I moved the staff, but what moved me? Now an atheist might say, well, clearly we can look at your brain and say that a neuron firing happened and it made you move your hand to move the staff, to move the rock. But all you would have to do is ask, well, what made that neuron fire the other one? And then once you answer that, what neuron firing made the neuron firing made the other neuron firing to make your hand move? So clearly there has to, if there is free will, there has to be something immaterial other than your physical body to act on your body for us to even have free will in the first place.
So I'd like to start first of all with this notion of free will and dualism that he talked about, and with the free will as well. Unfortunately, we're speaking of something that is a complete mystery to us. Knows that causation is a complete mystery in the natural physical world, much less an immaterial being doing the causing. Same thing with free will. Not entirely sure what free will is. And this isn't a cheap way out. It is a mystery.
If we're just pure physics, matter, and chemistry, physics, matter, and chemistry doesn't reason. Do you believe we have free will?
Free will's weird. I mentioned that was a mystery. Nobody.
So, if you think that we have reason to believe that free will is an illusion, so I'm assuming you lean to the side that we don't have free will, yet you take intellectual responsibility for believing we don't have free will. But if we don't have free will, how can you say that you freely chose to believe that? How can you hold me accountable for not believing that we don't have free will if there is no free will, it's just an illusion? If you don't have free will, you're determined to believe it.
Sure.
Is God necessary for morality? And no, is of course the answer. And Pastor Hernandez is correct in saying that's why we're here. Even if there were no objective standard, there's plenty of decent thought out there that says we are these sort of meaning-creating creatures.
If there is no God, there is no objective or ultimate meaning, value, or purpose. Now, to be objective, it is independent of human thought. To be subjective, it depends on what people think. So no, I am not saying that an atheist can't arbitrarily make up what they deem valuable, purposeful, and meaningful. I am saying that without God, these things literally do not exist.
But this phrase that without God, everything is permitted, is just a phrase.
One of the things he said that to say that without God there can be no morality is just a phrase. Okay, well the phrase, to say that it's just a phrase without God there's no morality is just a phrase about the phrase without God there's no morality. That's kind of a pointless thing to say in my opinion. There's no rebuttal there.
The claim from the religious position, and what is up for debate tonight, is that God is necessary for morality itself. But as it turns out, there are reasons why people believe that morality rests on God's existence.
But I want to clarify some terms here. And in philosophy, when we talk about morality, there's moral ontology and moral epistemology. Moral epistemology is how we come to know what morality is. Moral ontology is the grounding in which it exists. So it doesn't matter how I came to know morality. I'm not asking how do people come to know morality. I'm asking why does morality exists in the first place, and I argued in my opening statement that God's necessary for it. The topic is God necessary, not why do people behave good, or not do animals behave good. The topic was not, is there reasons we should behave good, which of course presupposes what good is in the first place.
Morgan Hunt describes the perspective of that Beckhoff is talking about, of a rational moral person considering the values and rights that ought to exist in a moral society.
In fact, the atheist David Hume said you can't get an ought from an is. For example, if my heart stopped beating and someone said, call a doctor, Eric's heart stopped beating, someone could easily ask, what is it, why should I call a doctor? Are you implying that his heart ought to beat? Because we can see that it is not beating, but what in the world makes it the case that it ought to be? Well, because Eric should be alive. Well, it's another ought. Why is it an ought that human beings should be alive? Well, because he's going to die. Okay, well, again, why? In other words, I'm not asking if he should or not. I'm asking where does this notion of oughtness come from? If there is no God, it's just your opinion.
Morality, in other words, end quote, in other words, is not an exact science.
Science doesn't touch morality. There's a lot of things that science can't touch, simply because science studies simply the materialistic world. Morality is a metaphysical thing. It's not something you can tangibly touch. Let me give you an illustration. If I were to put poison in a water bottle and give it to somebody, and I brought the top Nobel Prize winners of the world in every field of science, and I said, can you analyze what happened here? And they say, sure. The way the poison mixed with the water was such and the H2O, and a chemist can tell me what happened chemically, and perhaps a nutritionist can tell me what happened in the body when the person took the poison, and perhaps a biologist could tell me other things that are happening and functioning, but not understand that not one of these scientists could look under a microscope and say, yeah, and what you did was wrong, by the way. Because science doesn't touch morality. Science studies what is, not what ought to be. So science can show why my heart stopped beating, but you can't look under a microscope and say, therefore my heart should be. It just doesn't make sense to say that morality and science, somehow science will give us an explanation for morality.
God or no God, human beings have made substantial moral progress. An ecumenical desire for the well-being of others, advances in technology, and the continued pursuit of reason and understanding of our world has led to these advances.
That there is moral progress in the world, that we have learned to be better, and that we through our moral reason, through our reasoning, we've made progress. What the problem with this assertion is that he's using a moral statement to affirm that morality exists. It's a tautology, really. It's like saying the reason we should be good is because it's good to be good. Okay, that doesn't give me a reason why I should be good. That simply tells me that being good is good. We should be good because it helps humans flourish and technology is good for us. Okay, you're giving me a moral reason of why I should be moral, which is a circular argument. I'm not asking why we should be moral. I'm asking does morality even exist in the first place?
Whether it turns out that there is any universal or fixed grounding to our moral codes is irrelevant to human moral behavior and theorizing. We'll still behave morally and immorally. Humans are good, and we can be good. We don't need God for this to be so.
He said, again, talking about morality, he said, because humans act moral, well, we know God doesn't exist, and humans still act moral, therefore we don't need God for morality. This is called arguing in a circle, to say that since we know God doesn't exist, and there still is morality, then apparently we don't need God for morality. That's, of course, on the assumption that there is no God, and that morality still exists.
And finally, the idea that the metaphysical principle, that everything that exists needs a cause, as I mentioned earlier. Not only is that not necessarily true, that comes from our experience of the world and our human reasoning, and this was part of my point in my talk.
And I find it funny I find it interesting that earlier you said that the metaphysical principle, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, we only think that because it's our human reasoning that tells us, aside from the fact that your human reasoning tells you that it's just human reasoning that tells you that, so we shouldn't believe it. Are you not using human reasoning, the very thing that you said isn't valid enough to trust something, that there is objective morality? So how could you in one breath say human reasoning isn't sufficient to believe or trust a principle, but then in the next breath say that it's sufficient to trust that we have objective morality?
And so if there's less reason to believe, then there's more reason to think that morality comes from, at least in our case, human beings.
That objectivity and morality is not based on what humans think, which I would agree is based on something outside of humans. That is my point. That no matter what you think, if it is objective, it needs a grounding outside of us, because it is independent of our reasoning.
But even if that's objective, it's still progressed in reasoning. Maybe not human reasoning, maybe some other reasoning.
I agree with that.
And consider, if the universe really was created by an intelligent designer, then again, who's to say that that designer is necessarily the God of classical theology?
I gave a philosophical, logically deductive argument to why we do believe it is the classical God. In fact, I can reiterate it. If the universe began to exist, and the metaphysical principle that everything that begins to exist needs a cause, I can walk you through it again. If the universe is composed of space, time, and matter, and it had a beginning, then it would logically, deductively imply that whatever caused it had to be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. And since it made a decision to create, you don't have to call him God, call him what you want, but his attributes, spaceless, timeless, and material, would have to be a personal being since it made a decision to create, and have had to have been unimaginably powerful since it created something out of nothing. So if the principle, the metaphysical principle, that it begins and needs a cause, and cause of what? Time, space, and matter, then it had to be outside of time, space, and matter, it had to be personal and powerful. In the field of philosophy, there's something called epistemology, which is a study of knowledge and how it is obtained. To know anything, according to epistemology, you must first have a justification for why you believe something, without any good defeaters for it.
Famous paper, 1963, Edwin Gettier writes this paper. It's a page and a half long, showing why that's a mistake.
So he uses a justification to why justification is wrong.
Yeah, of course, but it's a justification in the right area. It's not just any justification. That's all I'm saying, and that's the limit of what I'm saying, is that it is possible to be wrong.
But do you think you could possibly be wrong about the possibility that I'm wrong? It seems that you're saying if we can't know something for certain, we shouldn't trust it. And then of course, no. Okay. Can you clarify that? So just to clarify, you do believe that there are things we can know for certain, without doubt.
We could be wrong about our mathematical proofs, yeah. So in that strong sense that you're talking about, no, but in the limited sense of our experience, sure.
So we can't be certain about, there's nothing we can be certain about, and you're certain.
Yeah, that's a classic. Yeah, very classic. Very classic.
What's certain?
So
it's a self-defeating statement to say that. I don't see how you could say that with certainty.
Right, but trust isn't an absolute.
Right.
Trust gets betrayed, and so we can't use that as any sort of appeal to anything.
And you trust that.
Yeah, I mean, you can do this all day long.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Just because we have these doubt.
It's sort of weird to think that, so these are sort of weird things to rest an argument on. And then we extrapolate backwards, weirdly enough.
And just because it seems weird to say that, it's weird to talk about absolutes. I think it's weird. And so I just find it weird that, yeah, sure, it's weird to think that the physics...
You keep saying things are weird. That's somehow a fear for something.
I love this weird.
All I'm saying, I'm really not trying to make decisions, I promise.
No, I believe you.
I'm trying not to. But I think in conclusion, we have heard arguments for why God is necessary, and have not heard any arguments for why He isn't. Thank you.